Welcome to A2A Conversations, an ongoing discussion about turning adversity into advocacy. Join us as we explore the power of purpose, service, and empathy, and the resilience we build when helping ourselves by helping others. Now here's our host, A2A founder, Jeff Bell.
Hi there, and thanks as always for tuning in. My guest today is an award-winning novelist who is using her writing as a tool for mental health advocacy. Barbara Claypole White has penned a growing list of powerful novels, each in some way chipping away at the stereotypes of invisible disabilities and focusing on the importance of community. The Unfinished Garden, for example, features a successful, charismatic hero with OCD, and Echoes of Family tells the story of a complex businesswoman who struggles with bipolar disorder. Barbara is a longtime member of the A2A Alliance and someone who over the years has greatly inspired me. So Barbara, I have really been looking forward to this particular conversation because one of my favorite things about adversity-driven advocacy is the wide scope of possibilities for it. And, some people will write a memoir about their experiences. Some people will go on a speaking tour. Others will start a blog or form a foundation. You have chosen to use your fiction writing as a tool for increasing understanding of mental illness. And I want to know, how did that path come together?
Well, it was a complete accident, an absolute accident. I'm a very sort of organic, instinctive person. I follow my instincts, and I've always wanted to write fiction ever since I was a little girl. I've always written in some shape or form. I was a press agent because, you're writing press releases, it's still, writing. I did some freelance journalism, but I didn't actually start work on my first manuscript until I was a newlywed, and I had moved from working in the London fashion industry to living in the Bible Belt in a college town. And I had no work experience that anyone understood. I had studied, medieval and women's history at university. And so while I was trying to find a full-time job, I thought, right, I'm going to start on that first novel. And that was a learning curve. And so it was just, I was noodling around trying to figure out what I wanted to say, what I wanted to write about. And fast forward 10 years, I think, well, maybe more than that, more than 10 years. And I had put the novel aside for a while because I got a full-time job, and then we moved to Carolina. My husband became a distinguished professor. I became a stay-at-home mom. We moved out to the forest, and we have this amazing son who's now 27 and a grad student. And until he was about 4, he was just this happiest little well-balanced person, and things started falling apart for him when he was 4 going into 5. And we didn't actually get a diagnosis, and we didn't start getting treatment that helped until he was 10, I think. And he had OCD and generalized anxiety disorder. And I became very focused on, as a full-time mother, with only one child, which is a luxury for a lot of parents, I could really focus on his mental health. And I wanted to figure out what was going on with him. And, I had grown up in a family with mental illness where mental illness was very definitely pushed aside, not talked about. There was terrible stigma, shame. I didn't want any of that for my son. So I thought, right, we're going to own this. We're going to figure out what's going on. And somewhere in the middle of all this, I'd started on another manuscript. And somewhere in the middle of all this character he appeared in my head. I can still see him. He's the love of my literary life. His name is James Neely. He is sexy and brilliant and successful, and he has severe OCD. And he ended up becoming the hero of what would become my debut novel. And I think the thing is that, James was in my head, and I kept thinking, oh, I kind of want to write about him. But I was many drafts into this novel, and then one day I thought, I can't let him go. He's speaking to me. And as soon as I got James on the page, it was an incredible epiphany. I thought, this is what I want to write about. I want to go behind the eyes of a character with what I call an invisible disability. I want to peel away the layers. I want people to see what it means to actually be, living with obsessive compulsive disorder and how that impacts your relationships. That's what I was really interested about, the impact of mental illness on families, but specifically on close relationships. And especially in terms of the Unfinished Garden, it was a romantic relationship. And, I had been told early on, oh, you'll never, a very famous agent said to me, this book will never get published because your hero is too dark to be a romantic hero. And I went, that sounds like a challenge to me.
And when you say too dark, is that because of the mental illness storyline?
OCD, yeah. So I was going, I don't think so. So anyway, so that was it. And I sort of, once I got James out on the paper and I got my first publishing deal, I kept wanting to go deeper and darker into people's inner lives, but into the lives of people who, other people might think were broken, or, from the outside, might not understand why that person was behaving the way they were doing, thinking that they were odd, that they were quirky, that, there was something wrong with them. And, inside these people, all my characters are, fighting these private wars. And I love that I can just peel back their layers. And what I actually love to do is to take someone who is in the middle of a mental health crisis and sort of throw them into the dumpster, into something really bad. The dumpster's on fire, whatever. Throw them into a terrible situation and see how they rise to the top and they become the best of themselves. And so, there has to be darkness in my fiction because that's the reality of life with mental illness. But there's also a lot of hope. And that is the hope that I think any of us who live in the trenches with mental illness need. And so, as I said, so it wasn't a conscious decision. But once I had started doing this, that was it. It was my niche. I had been told at one point to stop writing characters with mental illness. And I thought, well, maybe I've been told to write something lighter. I had tried a few times, but it's my passion. And, I connect with a lot of readers because they can associate with my characters. And I also come back to something that happened to me when our son was first diagnosed, which is that when I first wanted to understand OCD, I went to fiction, because I'm a huge reader. And I thought, well, it might be easier for me to read a novel about a character who has OCD rather than to go to all these textbooks. I mean, there weren't that many memoirs out. I mean, your memoir came out quite a few years after that, I think. And Nowhere Near Normal, Tracy Faust, I think, was the first memoir I read about OCD, but that was years after my son was diagnosed. And so to me, I was also trying to understand the world that my son lived in and my husband lives in and that I by default was living in. And I was also trying to make sure I wrote a hopeful ending or a happy ending, because that's what, I'm always reaching for.
That first debut novel did very well. I mean, it certainly established you as a substantial new writer out there. And you chose to continue writing characters with mental illness storylines. Has that been the case for everything you've tackled since then?
Yes. The novel that's on submission at the moment is probably a little lighter than some of mine, but I still have I have very broken guys in there. And even though my hero, Luca Hayward, who's a gin distiller, it's called the Gin Club, technically doesn't have an invisible disability. He's got his own private war with something that goes back a childhood trauma, really, that he's never overcome. But his son has crippling social anxiety and is being bullied because of it. So, anxiety is obviously it's an illness that I circle a lot in my work. And I feel it's not always necessarily intentional. Like people say to me, well, what illness are you going to be tackling next? And I say, well, I don't think of it that way. I'm writing a story about, the impact of mental illness on families, but I don't think of these as stories about mental illness. And I want to, I think one commonality that all my characters have is that they're all incredibly courageous and they're all incredibly strong. And and they all have, sort of funky, dark senses of humor. And I think, the courage is especially important to me because I have seen how hard my son has worked when he's been in a crisis just to get through. And I don't think we talk enough about that. When we talk about courage, we think about courage on a battlefield. But, if you're locked in a private war, you're still on a battlefield. Just because it's your own battlefield and nobody else can see it, or no one can really share it, it doesn't mean that, the war isn't real. And so that courage is very important. And something else all my characters share, something I learned from my son when he was in high school, which is that you are not your disorder. So none of my characters are ever identified by, I am depression, or I am obsessive compulsive disorder, or I am bipolar disorder. They're multifaceted.
I have a question about the character development itself. So as an author, you're doing plenty of research to really kind of learn the basics of these various mental health challenges that you are portraying fictionally. But you often hear that authors learn from their characters as well, who kind of come to speak to them along the way in the writing process and teach them. Talk about that two-way flow, if you will.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Because I'm a history major, I love research and I love oral history. And the way that I'm a very research heavy novelist, and I do these one-on-one interviews with people who are living the experiences I want to write about. And some of them I interview multiple times. And, and I steal from their lives. I steal their experiences, but I'm also sort of listening for, I'm listening for the ways that they have survived and the ways they find to kind of get through an intolerable, a very private and sometimes intolerable situation. And like when I started researching bipolar disorder for Echoes of Family, there was one point when I thought I started off with a lot of written research, and I was thinking, I don't think I can do this. I don't think I can go into the mind of someone who, has bipolar 1, as my heroine does. And then I started interviewing these women, and they were all different ages, and they all had different degrees of bipolar disorder. And they were the most inspiring people I had ever met. And that was when I kind of realized, oh my gosh, I know how to write Marianne. I just, I'd made the mistake. I had made the classic mistake of making her disorder, but I hadn't found her voice. So as soon as I find the character's voice, then I'm learning from the character, because then the character is actually often running and saying and doing things, and I think, oh my gosh, yes, and sometimes characters do things, when you get to know them really well, and it can be inspiring. And I think I learned more from Marianne, the heroine of Echoes of the Family, which is a weird thing to say since she's a figment of my imagination, than maybe I have from anything else I've done. I mean, I admired her so much. I admired the decisions that she made. And, I just love that feeling when you know a character really well and you're putting them in a room with another character and they just do something. I can't even describe it. So, I edit aloud and I run dialogue aloud. And that is often the thing for me that sort of takes me somewhere else. Because if I'm typing fast and, the characters are talking, if it's just an early draft and I'm just listening to the dialogue, often the dialogue just takes off and I go, oh, yes. That's the magic. What's going on, My husband laughs at me, because I talk about my characters as if they're real, but they are to me. They're real people. They're all still in my head.
And that's what makes them such effective communicators, I think, for people who are reading stories. So let me ask you this. You've talked about the challenges within your own family and raising a son with OCD. You have been in a caregiver position over the years. We at A2A talk about the fact that we help ourselves by helping others. This advocacy that you are doing through your fiction writing, in what ways does it motivate you through challenges along the way in your own family?
That's a great question. I think mainly it gets me out of my own headspace, because when it's something happening with your child, it can take over your life. It can be crippling. And when your child is in crisis, it's sometimes hard to reach beyond that and think, this is okay. We've been here before. We will get through this, and I find that when I'm doing advocacy work and I'm sort of focused on the big picture, I'm not so much locked into focusing on and trapped in what's happening in our world. And it's empowering. You think, yes, I have the power I can help someone. I can say the right thing to someone. I can make a difference.
It's interesting. You use the word hope a couple of times here. And I know that you can go to some dark places in your novels, but there's also always that string of hope that your characters want to convey. Talk about the importance of that, if you would.
I just think it's everything. I really do. When things are really bad, I know that if I can kind of shut things down for my son and keep them small and just get him, focused on getting through the day he's in, and I can do that with him and I can help him do that, that there's hope at the end of that, because our experience as a family has kind of taught us that. It's like white knuckle driving on the highway in a terrible thunderstorm, right? You just have to see what's in front of you, hold onto the wheel, get to your stop, get off, and wait for the storm to pass, right? And it's kind of like that sometimes. And so I think hope is everything.
So I want to wrap this conversation up, Barbara, by asking you to give one of your characters the last word here. Pick a character from one of your books and let us know what he or she would like to leave us with when it comes to the hope that is possible through treatment and support of loved ones when it comes to mental illness.
Oh, gosh.
Nothing like putting you on the spot, huh?
Oh gosh. Well, I think maybe it's a line I'm just looking at because I got my poster of Echoes of Family in front of me. It's not actually a line that Marianne says, but it's a line that Gabriel, my slightly broken but very sweet English vicar, says. And because the original title for that manuscript was Missing in Madness, because Marianne is very lost throughout most of it. And he says to her something to the effect of, you're not really lost if someone loves you enough to come find you. Lost is waiting to be found. And I sort of think about that when you're alone in a dark place. And I remember once when my son was little and he was in a really dark place saying to me, you don't know what's going on inside my head. You can never know. And I went, I know, but I'm still here and I love you and I'm going to be here. And I think that's what that means, is that, you're never really lost if someone loves you enough to stand by you, even in the dark times. And I think that's true for all my novels.
Well, listen, Barbara, I want to thank you for giving us some time today. I know how busy you are with all of your writing. You're doing such important work. And again, using your professional skill set in a way that advocates on behalf of so many out there who need that love and support. And I just want to thank you for all the great work that you're doing. And again, thank you for making time for us today.
And thank you for your work.
You've been watching A2A Conversations, a presentation of the nonprofit A2A Alliance. Guest views and opinions expressed in this production are those of the guests and do not necessarily reflect those of A2A, its advocates, advisors, or partners. To watch more of our A2A Conversations, please visit us online at a2aalliance.org.